morning. I'm Alyssa Gilmore, Global Head of Communications for Bloomberg Financial Products and Financial Narrative Founding Board Member. Welcome to our exploration of findings from the second Financial Marketers Index study conducted by Financial Narrative in collaboration with strategic insight agency Opinium. The purpose of this research is to give financial marketing and communications leaders visibility into our rapidly evolving landscape. Our presenters today are Giulia Prati, Vice President of Research U.S. at Opinium, and Alexa Nightingale, Research Director and Partner at Opinium. They will walk us through the results of the study and explore trends that we may see in our industry and profession that will require our attention in the months to come. During our presentation, we'll be posting some poll questions for your participation. We'll also be accepting your questions via the chat window, and we'll open these up for discussion after the presentation of results. So, let's get started. Giulia, can you tell us more about how the survey was conducted and who participated, and an overview of what we're going to see today?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be with all of you here today. And first of all, I want to thank all of you who participated in the research. So many of you on this call were probably respondents. So we've reached out to 105 financial marcoms leaders across the globe and conducted an in-depth online study from July to September of 2021, and it represents marketing and communications professionals across different business sizes, 56 marketing leaders, 37 communications leaders in a variety of different financial services sectors. And just taking a quick look at the insights that we'll walk you through today, one of the first, big areas that we're seeing in the data is this shift from COVID, everybody being in kind of emergency mode, and now moving into what we're calling and have coined BAU plus. So back to business as usual, and even turning their sights towards growth. Also, second kind of key finding we'll unpack in the research, the key barriers to success that marcoms leaders in the financial services space are seeing in their daily roles. And we're finding there's a bit of a need and a gap around a need for more strategic direction, as well as mental well-being really taking a hit in the past year, of no surprise to any of us, given the pandemic and all that has happened. But both of those really hindering success in the space. And then interesting findings around hiring and retaining talent in this new environment. And then looking ahead, we will look at the key priorities looking to 2022 with a rise in importance of communication and marketing around social impact and ESG initiatives looking to the future. So really excited to dive into all of it.
Terrific. Me too. Alexa, maybe you can share more on this concept of BAU plus and talk us through some of the biggest shifts we've seen from 2020 to 2021.
So yeah, sure. So our findings very clearly indicate that businesses are really kind of starting to come out of fight or flight mode towards what might be thought as business as usual. So what we've seen is a clear change in operational direction away from the crisis mode of the last 20 months, with a particular focus on COVID-19, towards returning to more normalized marketing. So within our data, we saw that pivoting strategies due to COVID-19 has dropped from being the top area of focus, down 9 percentage points from 2020, from 37% to 28%. And as businesses have been less disrupted by COVID, we're also seeing them focus more on retaining existing customers, an increase of 7 percentage points since 2020, and also aligning brand promise with customer experience, again, a 6 percentage point increase. So very much focusing on customers, shoring up their loyalty, and also kind of evidencing their brand promise through the experiences that they're delivering.
Now, I've certainly heard a lot from my peers over the past months to suggest that during the pandemic, A lot of our Marcoms teams had to step up as more traditional sales channels were cut off. Have we seen some results around that in the study?
Yes. So, firstly, I guess what we've seen as businesses have come away from this fight or flight mode is an increasing investment in tech and analytics to help support marketing and communication activities and help fuel business growth. So, what we saw is three key themes emerging. Firstly, we saw a more focus on advanced data analytics to help target those marketing activities better, whether that be through machine learning, big data, or Google Analytics. We also saw a greater focus on content creation and management to really help position businesses as kind of experts in their area, whether that be through video content, webinars, conferences, or thought leadership. And finally, we also saw continued increases in investment in social media, very much digital marketing and virtual communications being the critical part of the marketing mix to help spread businesses' messages and gain new clients.
Got it. And have teams been reorganizing themselves around these new investments as well?
Yes, so if we focus on marketing teams first, in 2020, we did see an upward curve in terms of both budgets and teams. And we are seeing that trend continue in 2021, particularly with marketing teams. So in 2021, we're seeing 63% of businesses saying they've increased their teams, and that's up from 51% in 2020. When it comes to marketing budgets, we have seen a slight slowdown in growth. However, we are still seeing net increases. So 41% of businesses saying that they've increased their budgets in 2021, which is a positive picture overall. And then if we look at communication teams more specifically, we've also started to see some recovery from COVID losses. So in 2020, as we saw them really focus on crisis comms away from traditional communication campaigns, we did see communications budgets and teams suffer. However, in 2021, we have seen some recovery. So we are seeing that 30% of businesses saying they've increased communications budgets and 35% saying they've increased communication teams. So again, a positive net increase. And if we continue to 2022, we also see quite a sense of optimism for the next year ahead. And that's particularly true of marketing teams. So marketing teams are feeling very optimistic about budgets and teams. 50% saying that they're expecting their budget to increase in 2022, and 66% that their teams are going to increase. Communications still positive, although on a slightly lower scale, but still we're seeing net positive increases, 35% seeing communication budgets increase and 49% expecting teams to increase in 2022. So overall, again, a positive picture.
That's definitely great to see. Well, why don't we now post our first poll question for our audience to weigh in? While we're looking at this evidence of growth in teams across the industry, audience, we'd love your view on what's driving that growth. So take a look at the poll question. If your team is growing, or if you're seeing other teams growing, what is driving that growth? We have a few options for you to select from there. So please take a minute now and give us your thoughts. Maybe we can move on while you're doing that. So we're growing, but I'm sure it isn't all rainbows and unicorns, right? I'm sure we've got some challenges to contend with as well, Giulia?
Yeah, absolutely. So here we asked Marcom's leaders what the biggest barriers were to success that they face in their roles at this time. And you can see some interesting shifts year over year. First, we see that, not having enough time to think strategically or big picture is still the biggest barrier. But we are seeing a really interesting trend around a lack of priorities and strategic direction. So you see, for instance, constant shift in priorities has grown as a barrier year over year as well as unclear overarching business strategy from the top. So there's a bit of tension happening there. And then we also see internal politics rising as a barrier, potentially with the rise of remote working, less face-to-face time. There may be a bit of a breakdown happening there. And one really interesting point, one of the biggest jumps, was in the share of respondents who told us that their own mental well-being was a barrier. So that's up to 11% this year from 3% last year. And really interesting to take a look at the difference between small businesses and larger businesses and the barriers that they're experiencing. So the smaller businesses actually say that one of their key barriers is needing a better understanding of their target audiences. Almost a quarter of them say that, compared to only 13% of larger businesses. Whereas at large companies, internal politics is a much bigger challenge, with 38% saying that that's a barrier compared to only 18% at small companies.
Looking at all of these challenges, they don't seem particularly surprising, given the constant stressors we've all been under. Is this common to other industries? Do you have any research from Opinium that shows that this is more common or different from other industries?
Yeah, so the financial marcoms industry is definitely not alone in this, especially as it regards to that spike in dealing with mental well-being challenges. So the steady decline in mental well-being is something we've seen at Opinium. We have a normative database of American workers that really reflects that data. So about 2/3 of American workers said they struggled with their mental health in the past year, which was up significantly from 55% in 2020. So there's definitely a challenge happening there. And a quarter of American workers saying they've experienced exhaustion or burnout. So we're seeing specifically big spikes in exhaustion and burnout across different industries. And it's interesting that despite these concerning increases in mental health problems, fewer people are actually telling us across the American workforce that they're taking time off to take care of their mental health. So there's a bit of a spiral happening there and a vicious cycle. So I think that's really important for our marcoms leaders to be thinking about how they take care of themselves as well.
That's pretty sobering.
Yeah, I think one really interesting finding as well was it's not just a perception or an impression that marcoms leaders are operating less strategically. We also saw evidence in our data that they are being asked to join big strategic meetings with the C-suite, for instance, budget meetings or strategy and update meetings with the CEO less frequently than last year. So unclear, if that's cause or effect, but it does seem like there's a bit of a breakdown in the strategic partnership between marcoms and the C-suite happening, perhaps as a result of COVID as well.
Well, that can't be good for us. Well, why don't we put up our next poll question? I think that's on this topic. So, audience, share with us, in your experience, what do you think are some of the biggest barriers to working strategically right now? And while you are answering that, I think we'll move on to our next section. And Giulia, maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about what we've learned about how hiring and retention of talent has been changing during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's really a perception amongst financial marcoms leaders that there's an industry-wide talent shortage. So about 3 in 5 marcoms leaders believe that there's this talent shortage. 30% of you said that it was a major problem. Another quarter saying, we do think there's a talent shortage. It's not a major issue. But clearly some challenges at this time in terms of hiring and retention. And it's been interesting to see how the pandemic has shifted employee expectations and priorities. So we asked marcoms leaders what they thought were the key factors needed to attract and retain top marcoms talent. And it was interesting to see flexible work really highest on that list alongside company culture. And interesting to see a bit of a difference between how men and women responded to that question, with 91% of women saying that flexible work was needed to attract the best talent compared to only 63% of men. But there clearly has been this shift towards, of course, flexible working is to some degree seeming to be an increasingly an expectation as we've all adjusted to it. And then looking, further down here, it was also interesting to see the difference between men and women in responding to the need to offer diversity and inclusion. So about a third of women saying that they felt D&I initiatives were key factors to attract the best Marcom's talent, compared to only 10% of men. But key issue here is that a few of our leaders feel empowered to actually offer these benefits to their employees. So less than a third, 31% of Marcom's leaders said they felt empowered to offer the attractive perks and programs that they feel would be necessary to attract and retain talent. And that empowerment really drops at larger companies. So only 18% of Marcom's leaders at companies with 500 plus employees said they felt empowered to actually be able to offer those perks that they felt were necessary. Perhaps smaller companies having more flexibility and sort of decision making, less red tape around some of these things might be one of the factors at play here. So we took a look as well at some quotes from our respondents, and it's clear that there's this perception that employees are becoming more selective in a very competitive environment. So an interesting quote here highlighting how, people are being very selective about who they work for and are no longer willing to sacrifice their lives for a job that doesn't provide meaning, fulfillment, or enough free time to live. And that's from a director of marketing that we surveyed. So, a clear sense here that the pandemic has caused us all to shift our priorities and think differently about what's important to us in the balance between work and life. And then on that note as well, we have another quote here from another director of marketing around more people prioritizing life over work, leaving jobs where they don't feel valued or fairly compensated or stagnant. And then there's an interesting theme as well in the responses we got around a sense that there's a lack of specific skills in the talent pool. So we took a look at understanding what the most in-demand skills were that Marcom's leaders felt were missing. And it was interesting to see, digital marketing really at the helm there, quantitative and analytic skills as well, amongst the most in-demand skills currently for the Marcom's space in financial services. And definitely as we look to, why folks are hiring, it seems that it is really driven by that growth. So to grow my team, to add new capabilities, and as we saw before, marketing teams are hiring at a faster clip than comms leaders across the board. But it really does seem to be driven by that growth that we're seeing, which is definitely encouraging and positive for the industry.
This is really interesting. I mean, any of you out there who have been thinking it's too late to start that data science certificate, clearly now is the time, and be demanding. So, Alexa, maybe we should move into our final section and hear what we've learned about how organizational priorities are shifting.
Yeah, sure. So I guess earlier we saw that companies are starting to return to business as usual, but today's Marcom's leaders are focused on so much more than before. And this is looking at the short term. So what are businesses communicating or marketing themselves, and which areas are really important for them? So we saw that trustworthiness and stability in uncertain times continues to still be the most important for Marcom's leaders in the short term, but also communicating their value proposition. And also, as we saw earlier, with this increasing focus on tech, communicating tech innovation is also very much high on the agenda. However, if we look onto the next slide, comparing the long term with the short term, so looking at the priorities over the next 2 to 3 years, whilst we still see those three priorities continuing to be still important, albeit trustworthiness and stability in uncertain times is expected to decline slightly in importance. Perhaps what's more interesting is actually looking at the increases in importance across data privacy, ESG, and social impact. And this is something that we've seen consistently through a lot of the research that we've done over the last year. And that's certainly something that has been accelerated by COVID. And also kind of a real indication that businesses are starting to look at their practices to become more sustainable and inclusive.
Yeah, and I suspect this isn't exactly shocking, given the broader focus on these issues in society. But let's see what our audience thinks and post our final poll question now. So, which do you think is most driving the increase in focus on social impact and ESG communications? Let us know your thoughts. And Giulia and Alexa, thank you so much for that fascinating overview of some of our key findings. Now, if you're ready, why don't we open up the floor to some questions from the audience? If you haven't already done so, please take a moment now, put some questions in the chat, and we'll pull them from there and discuss them.
So I think we have one question that has come up. And I know actually that there was some research on this in the study, but I don't think we got to cover much of it in the presentation. We asked about how leaders are growing their own careers and some of the biggest trends we were seeing in that regard. Giulia or Alexa, can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we asked leaders what do they need to get to the next step in their careers. And it was really interesting to see year over year, folks are saying that they need more connections and networking, as well as things like mentorship was up 7 percentage points, skill-specific training up, 20 up to 24% now, almost a quarter saying they need that to get to the next step, and further education also seeing an uptick there. So it seems like folks are really craving that connection and new skills, which kind of speaks to that skills gap that we were looking at in hiring in some of the past slides. But I think it's really interesting to see, the pandemic pushing folks towards wanting perhaps more networking, more mentorship, since there's been such a scarcity of that.
And do you think that scarcity is really what's driving people's need for self-improvement and stronger networks as well? Is it just that we haven't had the opportunities, or do you think that there is sort of a greater awareness that that there's an opportunity here, right? So we were looking earlier at that at the slide where data science and digital marketing were highlighted as areas where there's a demand. Do you think that's transparent to people who are looking to make a change?
Yeah, I imagine within the industry, they're probably really experiencing and feeling that shift towards more of that digital marketing, analytics, and seeing how important it is in their day-to-day roles. And perhaps, the pandemic and everything being virtual has only highlighted that those are the skills that are needed to move forward. So I think it's all kind of compounding factors, I suppose, pushing folks to seek those new skills.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. So we've got another question here, and it's specifically around sourcing talent, right? So we noted that there have been some changes in recruiting talent. The question that we have here what are the most effective ways to source talent short of hiring expensive headhunting firms? Now, I'm not sure that we actually had specific findings around this, but maybe given what we did see around hiring and recruiting, there's some color that we can give to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me pull up some interesting quotes that we had prepared as backup here. So we did ask folks, how their recruiting process changed in the past 12 months. And I think it's interesting, moving away potentially from expensive headhunting firms. And I think this is something we've actually seen in our firm as well. But folks are leveraging more social media and their own networks to recruit. So we have some heads of marketing and chief communications officers saying that they've leveraged their personal networks and perhaps LinkedIn more rather than traditional means, or posting perhaps the job on the website and calling it a day, or using those headhunters. And then it's been interesting to see as well. Of course, the recruiting process has gone fully virtual for a lot of folks. So we had a comms manager tell us that all interview stages at their company, all 3 rounds shifted to virtual only. Even, usually the final round would be in person. And so a lot of folks just completely making that shift, which makes sense. But it seems like also the hiring process has become much faster and quick turnaround in the competitive environment. We see lots of folks, shifting and moving to new companies right now, and in the past several months. So, for instance, we had a head of comms tell us that they made an offer to a candidate who had been in the pipeline for only 2 weeks, and she had already 2 other offers on the table. So it seems like folks are having to just move much more quickly when it comes to hiring, making offers, clearing their calendars to make room for interviews, because it is a very competitive space right now.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of these make sense. I mean, these resonate certainly with me and what I've seen over the last, you know, almost 2 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to contemplate whether some of these changes will be more permanent, even if they don't have to be, right? So will we ever go back to 20 in-person interviews in a row, while recruiting? Or will
Yeah.
we permanently sort of shift some of these activities? Another question has come in that I think is really interesting. I don't think we asked anything specifically about this,
Mm.
but it's whether we see more people who are moving around, whether they're moving more towards fintechs than sort of legacy financial firms. And I don't know if in the research where we were looking at some of the different challenges of smaller or larger companies, maybe we got any sense for that.
I don't. So we didn't ask specifically, you know, where folks were looking to move, if they were coming from a big company looking to move towards a smaller, or a fintech type of company. But that would certainly be a really interesting area to look at for next year. We did, I mean, to your point, have some data here around how larger companies and smaller companies are trying to attract talent, or what they think is most important, which may be potentially relevant. So, leaders at larger companies thinking that higher salaries and growth opportunities are what's needed to attract talent. So potentially those are some of the more traditional large companies in this space, whereas we see fintechs and sorry, not fintechs, we see small to medium-sized companies recognizing perhaps that flexible working is more important to attract and retain talent. So they're definitely assuming, perhaps some of the fintechs would be in the small to medium size relative to some of the behemoths in the industry. It does seem like they would have more success attracting people right now, given the importance that we saw that people are giving to flexible working in this new environment. And those SMEs are recognizing that flexible work is the way to attract folks. So making a few leaps there from the data that we do have, but could be an interesting way to think of it. And certainly not to say that all fintechs are small to medium sized, but perhaps trying to link with those trends. What are your thoughts, Alyssa?
Yeah, I mean, this makes a lot of sense to me, and I think absolutely looking at it more from a small company to a large company dynamic, as opposed to sort of thinking through whether or not a company is focused on fintech versus legacy financial services, right? Certainly, I think culture and a company's ability to be nimble and responsive in shifting their culture as talent needs demand, is probably something that you're going to see across companies of all sizes, right? So some small companies will be better at shifting their culture, and
Right.
some large companies will be better at shifting their culture. Certainly, it can be a little more difficult to turn a large boat than a small boat in some regards. But I think you'll probably see companies that will do that well at various sizes. And I think that if you're someone who's looking to make a jump, that should probably be part of the questions that you're asking when you're evaluating opportunities, right? Is how is the culture evolving? I think we may have some poll questions ready to look at. The question here was around team growth. If your team is growing, what is driving growth? So not a lot of people seeing shifting budgets from sales to marketing. I don't know why I'm not entirely surprised. Budget rebounds, after COVID. That's good to see. Certainly, it looks like we're seeing mostly increased areas of responsibility for my team. And I think that's something that, as we spoke about earlier, we are seeing Marcom's teams being asked to do things that maybe traditionally weren't sitting in the Marcom's realm, or having to be more creative, as some maybe direct sales channels have been cut off or constrained. Anything here jump out to you?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because we also saw within the data how sort of strategic thinking was one of the barriers. So it's actually really positive that we're seeing that the biggest area is a fact that actually teams are having more responsibility. I think that kind of reflects the fact that there is that emphasis on digital marketing and analytics, which has really grown since the pandemic, and I guess sort of expanding the remit, as you're saying, of Marcoms into those areas. So certainly kind of a very positive picture. And actually, I was quite surprised. I actually thought that potentially budget rebounds after COVID would be the most, the kind of, I guess, the winner in the poll. So it's nice to see that actually it's a bit more positive. It's actually that it's about increased areas of responsibility, not just that potentially perhaps COVID hasn't had such an impact as we might first have thought.
As a team leader myself, I'm encouraged to see that not everyone is being asked to do more with less as well. It seems some people are actually being asked to do more with more, which is always a better position in which to be. Should we take a look at the next poll question? Working strategically. So, Alexa, building on your commentary just there. In your experience, what are the biggest barriers to working strategically? All right, so lack of direction from leadership doesn't seem to be a huge issue. Shifting strategies due to COVID. I imagine last year, had we asked this question, that would have been a much greater impact. All right, lack of time, 36%, certainly, and it looks like just being edged out by focus on immediate priorities versus longer term goals. I wonder to what degree that's a challenge, because some of those longer term goals are maybe less clear than they were in the past. Any thoughts on this one?
Giulia, feel free to jump in. But I guess my immediate thoughts around that was, as we've seen with kind of business as usual plus, that actually Marcom's leaders do have not just only to kind of, I guess, looking at the most immediate goals and sort of returning to more normalized marketing strategies, are actually have got so much more responsibility, looking also towards, I guess, ESG, which has become so much more important, something that we've seen quite a lot through a lot of the research that we've done over the past year, which has been accelerated by COVID. So I guess they're looking at, obviously, some of those normalized marketing activities, such as kind of shoring up client loyalty, but actually there's also quite a lot of other things that around sort of brand purpose that they're focusing on.
Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense to me. Giulia, any additional thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I was just looking back at the slide where we asked folks about their biggest barriers to success, and the top one is not having enough time to think strategically or big picture. So there is an element where people were responding about just being frazzled and perhaps not having so much on their plate that so that element of not having enough time definitely is, I suppose, consistent with what we were seeing in the overall survey, which definitely makes sense.
Yeah, something else that occurs to me as I look at this and the focus on, lack of time, at the same time, immediate priorities, those two don't seem to go really well hand in hand, right? I have no time, but I have all these urgent things that I really need to handle. And, I have no doubt that that tension also contributes to some of the challenges we're seeing in mental well-being.
Yeah, I'm sure that is the case. Of course, like the onslaught of just having to process a ton of immediate priorities is always a challenge.
All right, well, maybe we can look at that last one, which I think was about some of the emerging issues. Yep, ESG and social impact. So what do we think is most important in driving the increase in focus in social impact and ESG communications? All right, so here we've got a little bit more of a split. So positioning ourselves for future growth, not surprising to see that, receiving the least amount of responses here, especially given the last question response where people aren't really thinking ahead as much, right? Changing priorities, more focus on social good and social pressure. Pretty even split there. And so I'm wondering, how do you read that? So is it changing priorities being my company's priorities are shifting and social pressure is more that, we're getting pressure to do that as a company? How do you read those?
Yeah, I think I'm not surprised actually that the results are quite even, because I think in a way it's sort of an element of all three of those things that is driving kind of focus on ESG. And I think you're right. I think changing priorities, social pressure to some extent, I guess, is driving changing priorities. And we've seen from previous research, it does vary very much depending on industry, but also almost kind of whether you're focusing on consumers versus kind of B2B. There is that kind of social pressure. Essentially now as well, that kind of there is so much more scrutiny from the media, from the public around how companies are behaving, and that's something that is also obviously relevant in the financial services industry, and something that hasn't always been particularly sort of known for within the financial services industry, obviously through sort of reputational issues. So I think that's something that is almost, it's now becoming increasingly important. And of course, I guess, especially within the financial services industry, if we think about kind of an increase in sustainable investing and ESG investing, that's completely skyrocketed over the last sort of 12 months since COVID. That's something that also needs to be reflected in financial services own practices.
Yeah, I think we're certainly seeing, among our clients that there is absolutely a need for them to be able to accommodate more mandates in this area, right? I think especially when we look at some of the E in ESG. And so, whether that pressure is coming from society or that pressure is coming from investors, I think, pressure is probably pushing some of that change. I believe that a lot of companies are also, intrinsically interested in making some of that change. So I would be curious. That it might be an interesting thing to follow up on sometime, is to unpack a little bit more how much is being driven sort of by a decisive shift in company cultures versus feeling this need to sort of respond to outside pressure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's a little bit of both, and different companies are on different stages of that journey. But it's something that we've seen across the board that transcends
sort of, I guess, the whole financial services industry in that concerted effort to be more, I guess, focused on sustainability and diversity and all the things that encompass ESG.
Whatever's causing it, certainly a a good thing for us to be thinking about. So let's see. I think there might have been another couple of questions that came in. Oh, here's one. What differences did you see between marketing and communications departments across the board? Certainly we went into a few of those differences. Was there anything else that stood out to the two of you as you went through some of the survey results?
So I guess just thinking about the priorities, we actually saw quite a consistent picture. So in terms of that first slide I talked about, in terms of what's most important for you right now, we did see quite consistently that pivoting strategies due to COVID-19 has declined, and there is that kind of more emphasis on normalized marketing activities. I think where we saw the biggest differences was actually through company size rather than function. So those were where we saw where aligning brand purpose with customer experience, that was much more emphasized with larger companies compared to smaller companies, and aligning marketing and sales is much more emphasized with smaller companies compared to larger companies. So I'd say that the biggest sort of changes, I guess, that we saw, which we pulled out in the data, were actually around the changing teams and budgets. That's where we saw the biggest shift, but elsewhere we saw fairly consistent results across marketing and communications.
Excellent. Giulia, anything on your mind to weigh in there?
I think, predictably, I suppose, in terms of what the most in-demand skills are, we saw differences there with the communications leaders telling us that external communications was a bigger and more important skill than digital. Well, even I think, whereas the marketing leaders were saying, digital marketing definitely a top skill for them. But it was interesting. Our communications leaders still said that digital marketing was a bigger or more in-demand skill than external comms. So that's kind of interesting to see perhaps how the communications function is kind of starting to merge and overlap with marketing overall. So some interesting slight differences there, but they were both quite almost even in thinking that quantitative and analytics skills were in demand, so 27 versus 22% for comms leaders. So again, interesting to see how some of those most in-demand skills are kind of consistent, as well as those two functions perhaps start to have more overlap.
Yeah, I think that focus on analytics isn't surprising to me, certainly. I wonder if we had given an option for digital communications, if you would have seen that rise to the top as well. I think, as a communications leader, certainly, we're certainly seeing the opportunity to do a lot more in the digital realm as well. So not exactly surprising to see some of that cross-pollination coming over from the comms side. I think we might have time for one more question. Let's see. All right, so we have one here. Can you talk a little bit more about the things leaders are focused on for their own growth? What types of opportunities or training are leaders looking at for themselves? Any findings that shed some light on that? Or anything you've seen in other opinion research?
Yeah, we did see that big, need and desire for skill-specific training growing, greater desire for mentorship year over year, which we talked about a little bit, and definitely seeing spikes in folks, seeking and wanting more education in general. So, as well as networking. But we did not delve too deeply into like what specific areas. I assume some of that, as we looked at the most in-demand skills, might be related to, analytics, quant, digital marketing, etc. Any thoughts on your end, Alexa, or perhaps Alyssa, what you're seeing? Go ahead.
I think it was more around networking, really, and I guess come outside of coming out of COVID, everyone's been remote working. There was certainly sort of a real appetite for networking and support to help kind of further careers. And that's something that was much more exaggerated compared to last year. So we're certainly seeing this sort of craving for that to come back, hopefully not just virtually, but also in person now that COVID is slightly, hopefully gone.
Yeah, I think that's right, and for me certainly, being involved in financial narrative and being able to engage with my peers is something that I've really highly valued during this time, but very much looking forward to when we can do an event like this in person again. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up the questions. Thank you so much for joining us today, Giulia and Alexa, and sharing a few of the standout results from this research. I know there's so much more that's going to be in the larger findings. We'd like to extend a big thank you to LinkedIn for sponsoring this study. I'd like to congratulate our iPad winner who has been notified. And thanks to all of you who participated in the study and attended this event. In appreciation, we will send you a copy of this presentation, which has been recorded, and the full report, which has even more interesting findings than we were able to get into today. So be sure to look out for that in your inbox shortly. If you're in a real rush, it will also be available for download on our website, which is www.financialnarrative.org. There it is. And please remember that URL, bookmark it, and check it out regularly to see other upcoming events. I think our next event coming up on October 14th is about the changing role of marketing in asset management. That's going to be a banger, as my 15-year-old son would say. And our speed networking event on November 9th, where I hope to see you all there. If you are not yet a member, we'd love to have you. And you can apply, guess where? At that website, www.financialnarrative.org, on the Explore Membership tab. You can also find us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and even on Instagram, where we post events and useful content for our members. So thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.